Welcome to Third Space. I'm your host, Jen Court. Third Spaces are the spaces outside of home and work where we go to gather to share our thoughts and our ideas. Think of your local coffee shop. And this podcast is called Third Space because I want you to feel almost as if you're overhearing a conversation in your local coffee shop or restaurant that just gives you something to think about. My guests are leading thinkers, educators, doers, and innovators in equity, diversity, inclusion, and justice, and all of them connect their relationship to schools. So it seemed fitting at this point in our Third Space episodes to talk to a counselor. About what identity development is like for kids, especially as we're thinking about kids who feel like they don't have a lot of peers around them who may be in the same social identifier. So I've invited my friend and colleague, Phyllis, to join us. Phyllis is a counselor, a journalist, an author, a book coming out. We'll talk about that soon. So welcome, Phyllis.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you. Can you tell us a bit about what you do and who you are and just introduce our listeners to your work?
Sure. I am a school counselor at Sheridan School, which is an independent K-8 school in the district. I am a therapist. I work mostly with young adolescents, but also with kids. And I write a column often for Washington Post on parenting, counseling, and education. And beyond that, I mostly am constantly thinking about these issues all of the time.
And we're so glad you are. And followers of Phyllis are familiar with what I experience regularly, that anytime she posts something, I stop what I'm doing to read it because it's like parent education and professional development at the same time. And we will put links in that because I'm sure listeners will want to follow your work as well. So thank you for taking the time to talk to us about this.
Thanks for talking to me. Yeah.
Sure. So when we think about identity development, and I want to be sure, because you and I are both counselors and therapists, it's pretty easy for us to fall into jargon. So I'll always explain terms and ask you to do the same. But when we think about identity development, where kids are growing into who they are, one of the things that I think kids talk about struggling with quite a bit is when they're growing into their identity and they don't have teachers who have the same social identifier. Maybe they're questioning their sexual orientation or their gender, or maybe they're one of the few students of color in their class, or the few girls on the team, or whatever it is. When they don't have peers, that can be an exceptionally challenging and difficult time as they're growing into themselves. And just wondering if you can share with us some of the things that you've noticed over the years with that kind of thing of when kids are struggling.
Sure. And I think in middle school in particular, we have to remember that all kids are trying to figure out who they are and what their identity is and if they're good enough and who they'll be. And, they're questioning everything from their sexuality to how well they perform academically and athletically. And so it's just a difficult time in general. But when you layer on top of that something that sets them apart in another way, it can be very disconcerting. And so what I found is what they all tend to crave is that sense of normalcy, that sense of being surrounded by others who are going through a similar experience, which is why I'm such a big believer in affinity groups. Just to give them a chance to talk and to normalize whatever it is that they're feeling personally.
So affinity groups are often misunderstood because people feel that, I don't know, kind of the reputation around them is that they can be exclusionary when actually they're quite the opposite. And just for listeners who haven't heard previous episodes, affinity groups are different from ally groups. Ally groups are when you have kids coming together who have all kinds of differences between them, but maybe they're the same age. And that's a group where kids are coming together to talk about common concerns. Affinity groups are where you get to be in a space with somebody who has one of the same social identifiers as you, the same gender or the same race, sexual orientation, religion, whatever it is. So having that safe space to talk about something that is unique to the group that you're in at the time. And I know you run affinity groups for your students. What are some of the things you've noticed or some of the things that you think can be challenging or tricks because schools often struggle with whether or not they should implement affinity groups and then how to do it.
Yes. One of the things that I think is really important is figuring out what the need is in the school. And so at any given time, I might have 3 different affinity groups, but they're reflective of what the needs are in the community. So right now I have a group for kids who were adopted. It was just, there were enough kids who were really struggling with what that meant for their identity that I brought them together. And by affinity, they're not necessarily all exactly the same. In fact, I have one boy who wanted to join the affinity group because his 2 dads used an egg donor, and he really related to these kids who were trying to figure out what their biological mother might have been like, because for him that was something he was grappling with too. So kids can come together with one affinity and discover that they have other things in common. And just having that space to normalize it, even things like divorce, if your parents are splitting up, you might not feel comfortable talking about that or even sharing that with a single child in your class. But in the space of a room where everybody is talking about how to manage the conflict or how to manage going through between 2 different houses, it just gives you a space where you can breathe and say, okay, my experience is similar to their experience, and we can both get through this and we can support each other as we do.
Sounds wonderful. How do you get the word out there about the groups you could offer? Or conversely, how do you find out from kids what they need a group about?
A few years ago, I was in a very, very large public middle school, and I had a few students who were seeking, at the time it was a GSA, so it wasn't an affinity group, it was both straight kids and allies, and they wanted to found one. There was none in the school at all. And at the time, I thought, great, and we, went through the hoops of talking to the administrators and making sure that they had thought through advertising and safety and that they felt supported and protected. And when it was launched, it was so successful, at least on the surface, because to an outsider and even to me, who is part of pushing this through, along with the principal, it looked like, well, lots of kids showed up and everybody is supportive and now they have their space. And 2 things came out. Maybe, I guess this is now 3 years later, I reconnected with the student who started that group. And I said, reflecting on it now, reflecting on what it was like to start a GSA at a huge school, do you feel proud? Do you feel, proud of that legacy? And she said, I do. I'm really proud of the legacy. She said, but it was extremely hard. And I said, tell me about that. And she said, well, at the time, the entire community was doubting the need for a GSA, and it brought a lot of hate to the surface, a lot of comments about androgynous kids, comments that there were no gay kids in the school. So underneath the surface, it was really much more complicated. And I think as adults, we can miss that nuance because kids don't share all of those details. But 3 years later, with a little bit of maturity and hindsight, she was really able to articulate it very clearly. And that then now, going forward, one of the things I've learned, and this brings us back to affinity groups, is that it's not enough to have a GSA, because they tend to get involved with advocacy work, which is important. And it's important for kids who are LGBTQ to have the sense that their classmates are supportive of them and are, trying to affect change and work for human rights alongside them, but it doesn't meet that need for the affinity piece of it. So we added an affinity group at my current school for kids who are out or questioning, and it's a space where they can talk about what it's like to come out for the first time, or to talk about if they want to come out, and to talk about that experience or what their long-term concerns are in a way that they might not feel comfortable doing in a group with straight allies as well.
So much powerful stuff there. And I'm thinking about where to start. I mean, first of all, I want to just let listeners know, if you're wanting to have more information about GSAs or gay straight alliances or LGBTQ, lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender questioning and or queer students, you might want to listen to the episode with Philip McAdoo, who offers great insights on this. When I think about this affinity group and the specifics around sexual orientation, around gender, I always go to, what are some of the ways that we could identify problems and try to solve them ahead of time. And so I haven't heard this in a long time, but it's now resurging. And, about 25 years ago when I started as school counselor, there was a lot of concern that if we had GSAs in schools, we were encouraging kids to be gay. And we know, of course, from research and science that that's not possible. But that conversation tended to really dissipate as we learned more and developed more in our thinking. But now I'm hearing the same thing about transgender kids and non-binary kids who don't fit into male or female, that in having affinity groups where kids are allowed to explore their gender, that maybe we're encouraging them to be other than the gender they were assigned at birth. So have you had any of those kinds of resistances? I mean, they usually do come from parents, and it usually does come from fear. But I'm wondering if you've had anything like that in any of the schools you've been in.
What I've seen is a lot of fear and concern and tears on the part of parents. And, I think a lot of that is understandable. The child that you have raised to a certain age as one gender is now identifying as another. And there's a sense of loss, and there's a sense that, there certain procedures or hormonal treatments are not easily reversible or reversible at all. And so they want to make sure they're making the right choices. And I haven't had personally anyone, accuse me or accuse my school of trying to turn someone transgender. Generally, I've been approached by the parent. But what my response to that is regardless of what they end up being, don't you want your child to grow up feeling that they're supported for who they are and who they see themselves as? Whose need are we addressing here? And what harm do you do by allowing a child to explore their identity on their own without being controlled by somebody else who really is not inside their mind and can't think for them?
Which fits with so much of what we think about when we're helping kids navigate that whole identity development. As you were saying, for all kids, it's a struggle and a challenge. And when we're growing into ourselves, and then you add in these other layers. And if we come at it from the perspective of, we want kids to feel seen, we want them to feel heard, we want them to feel loved, we want them to feel respected, then it seems like affinity groups, I mean, what could the harm be?
Exactly. Whereas you can do a lot of harm by invalidating who a child says they are. So, I would say to the person who doesn't want to call, let's say, a child by a different pronoun or by a plural pronoun or something that doesn't feel comfortable for them, as educators all the time, you're making choices that are about the child and not about yourself. And this is really no different. If your boss or your supervisor said, from now on, I'm not going to call you Phyllis. I find that hard to say. So from now on, I'm just going to call you Lisa. It would be incredibly offensive and unsupportive and unnecessary. And I feel the same way about honoring kids' wishes about what they wish to be called or how they wish to be treated. There's no need. And I think schools are really making a lot of adjustments to stop separating by gender and to stop, there are a lot of changes that have happened even in the last few years, whether it's not separating kids for health and wellness or sex ed classes, or, what is it necessary to separate kids for teams in PE by gender. I think there is overall more sensitivity over what it is that the assumptions we're making and the labels we're putting on people simply by doing things the way they've always been done.
Which, that could be applied as well to, I'm thinking of, if somebody decided to call you Lisa and, then I wonder, do you feel like you have a space to say something, or do you just internalize that discomfort? Because that's certainly the experience that I hear from a lot of my students of color, where teachers will call them by another student's of color's name. And after a while, they're like, okay, we just deal with it. And it seems as we're thinking about supporting them through their identity development, we also want to support them in being advocates for who they are, and to be able to speak truth to making sure that they're visible in the spaces they're in.
That's such a good point. And one exercise that I think every teacher should do is to shadow a student who's completely dissimilar from them for a day. I'll often have students, I had a young Black girl tell me she felt literally invisible. And this was in an environment where I was really surprised. I felt like she should be seen, but it's not my place to say you should be seen. Obviously, she didn't feel seen. And a big part of that was there weren't many other kids that she felt she could hang out with that had her background or her experience. And that was alienating in and of itself. And that was how she felt. But as teachers, if you spend a day shadowing from the moment you get to school until the end of the day, you can really experience what it's like for a child, whether they're deaf, whether they're, racial minority, or whether they have a learning disability. It doesn't really matter what it is, but just to experience school through their eyes is really eye-opening.
Yeah, I used to call that one of my principal's privileges, that I used to, when I was a principal, that I would shadow students with their permission, of course. And I found many things, one of which I was always so physically exhausted and cognitively exhausted by the end of the day, and marveled at all that we expected them to do.
It really is amazing. Amazing.
Yeah. And it's also, I did make a point to shadow students whose identifiers were very different than mine, and had experiences where I saw kids being called by the wrong name, or being looked over, or whatever it was, some of the things that they were saying that they were experiencing, I was able to see that. I would believe that that's their experience anyway, whether the teacher intended that or not. But to see it up front is a very different moment. And when your students are telling you those kinds of things, and they're not a student that you can shadow during the day, because you can't, you're one person, you can't shadow everyone. How do you support them when they're coming to you saying, I feel invisible, or I feel like I'm not seen or heard, or I'm not, thinking of students that I've had over the years where they would say, I know my teacher's a nice person, but I don't hear my teacher say, I support and celebrate this, whatever it is. I mean, we've talked a lot about sexual orientation, or I support and celebrate this. So without those visible kind of signs and messages, kids often fear that the teacher is not supportive. So what do you say to them in those moments?
Well, I do two things. One is I problem solve with the child, because I think the antidote to feeling invisible, the antidote to that anxiety that you don't matter, is to empower them and to give them a sense of agency. And so I will brainstorm with them. What are some things we could do? What is it you would like your teacher to know? What is the best way for us to communicate that? Give me concrete examples of when this is happening. Would you like me to come observe? And much as you had said when you did it yourself and you were able to point to specific examples, I think that's really helpful for teachers. I've never had a teacher not be receptive to that kind of feedback, particularly if it's given by the student, him or herself. But I think teachers appreciate honesty and authenticity, and kids appreciate honesty and authenticity from the people who are teaching them. And even if it's as simple as a student saying, I feel, so this is more about mental illness than us being a part of a, marginalized group. But I had a student who felt like every time they talked about something related to depression or anxiety, it was a real trigger for them. And so the teacher just did a simple thing. She would give the kid a heads up. Today we're going to be talking about X, Y, or Z. It might have something related to do with the topic that you're sensitive to. How can I make it more comfortable for you? What is it that you need from me? And then after the fact, to go back to the child and check in to say, I haven't forgotten. I know that was tricky for you, whatever the issue happens to be. Were you comfortable with how I handled it? What could I do differently next time? And just engaging the child in part of that problem-solving process, I think, is really helpful. And then on a structural side, what is the curriculum including? Is the kid seeing mirrors and people who look like them? What is the literature that you're using? Who are the teachers who are teaching them? Is there diversity on the staff itself? So all of these things play into whether or not a child feels comfortable in the environment. So I had a fourth grade boy who passed our middle school principal in the hall, and our middle school principal is out, and he is married to a male teacher, and he has an adopted son. And this particular boy he's being raised by two dads, and he just very matter-of-factly went up to this middle school principal, who he didn't know personally, and said, "Are you the principal who's married to a man and adopted a son?" And the principal said yes. And he said, "I like that. You're like me." And it was so simple and matter of fact, but it was so important for him to have someone in his school who represented his experience.
Yeah. And that's part of the ongoing work. I recorded an episode earlier with Carolyn Miller and Courtney Peterson, the human resources directors at Sandy Spring Friends School and Sidwell Friends School, talking about diversity, equity, inclusion, and justice in hiring, because we know from the research, of course, that all kids do better when they have diversity in their teaching staff. But it is something that schools have to be really deliberative about to make sure that they are having faculty and staff who represent the students. I wanted to dive a little deeper into the reality of kids who are struggling with a mental health issue, because I hear kids tell me frequently that they feel like when we're talking about diversity, equity, inclusion, and justice, we often overlook mental health issues. And there is still so much stigma and shame around mental health issues that a lot of times kids aren't asking for help until they've really gone far down a road in terms of self-destructive behavior against themselves, or internal self-destructive thinking, or whatever it is. And I'm wondering what, when you're thinking about mental health issues in schools, what do you think some of the things are that schools really need to be thinking about so they're supporting them? And I'm also particularly interested in mental health issues from the perspective of kids who are in historically minoritized groups, and they're alone as their social identifier in their school. That would, I would imagine, exaggerate any mental health issues that they're already struggling with.
Well, we know that kids are at risk for mental health issues if they're bullied. We know that they're at risk for mental health issues if they've had trauma, if they are not resilient. So we know that there are certain things that put them at risk. We also know that if you are gay, lesbian, transgender, non-binary, whatever, anything in that category, LGBTQ plus, you're much more likely to be bullied. So those facts alone make it really important to not neglect the mental health issue. And then there are a lot of other reasons not to neglect the mental health issue. For starters, especially in that 10 to 14-year-old range, there's been a 30% increase in suicide. And in all kids, there's been a 50% increase in anxiety and depression. I was talking to another counselor recently who said, the good news is that parents are more open. They're more likely to tell me if their child is seeing a therapist. They're more likely to tell me if their child is hitting a rough patch or if there's a problem at home and I should pay closer attention. She said, the bad news is that kids are less resilient. They're, raised a little bit more in a hothouse, garden, and, one stray comment can set them off for a whole day. They can spend a whole day undoing the damage from that one comment. So the question is, what can schools do to help kids manage stressors a little bit better? And I personally think there's a lot that schools can do. For starters, I think we need to make sure that there's open communication between home and school, particularly in middle school where communication tends to drop off. I think parents should reach out and say, not only do I want reports, I am very open to hearing news that my child's mood has changed or that they don't seem like themselves. And the reason I say that is because teachers might feel uncomfortable about calling home about non-academic issues, and just having a parent give them permission is a starting place for that. And then also, teachers don't always feel equipped to jump in and intervene when they suspect a mental health problem. So I think we could do more to teach teachers. There's something called the youth mental health. I'm forgetting the name of the program right now, but it's in a couple 100,000 educators have done this so far, but it teaches educators to spot the signs, to recognize the signs of mental illness in kids or substance abuse, actually, and also to intervene and get them help and to empower teachers to feel like they can do something. And even if that means you just walk them down to the counselor, or you just identify yourself as somebody that a child can talk to. You define anxiety. I might not be the person who can help you solve these problems, but I can help you make sure you get the support you need. So just making it less of a taboo subject and opening it up and having it be part of kids' experience, particularly because tweens don't recognize depression and anxiety in themselves necessarily. I know in this region, in Montgomery County, they just started training every single student using a program called SOS, Signs of Suicide, so that they can learn how to identify the signs of anxiety and depression in their friends and report and tell an adult. And the reason they're training them is because adults have a very, very low rate of spotting it in kids. 50% of parents don't even know that their own child is suicidal. So we really want to be leveraging kids to help each other as well, just to make sure that nobody's falling through the cracks.
Which supports them and gives them agency. And we will look up that information that you shared and put it in the program notes so that listeners can access it.
Oh, it's called Youth Mental Health First Aid.
Awesome. Thank you. And you shared a couple of things. I always feel like we open up these conversations and parents and teachers are like, okay, now what do I do? And you gave some things that I think are really pragmatic in terms of teachers and administrators looking at the known risk factors for mental health issues. The list that you gave, and then it gets more detailed after that. We know kids who are whose parents are going through a divorce in middle school can have an elevated sense of anxiety, and there are, a lot of other risk factors that we know of that schools could almost create, I'm thinking and speaking, so I'm not sure if it'll come out well, but almost like a learning plan for students where we're looking at the known risk factors and then what do we know about students to help identify the kids who could potentially be at more risk, which of course doesn't mean saying, labeling them, but teachers would be well served to know the risk factors and know the students in their class who have them as much as they're able to comfortably be shared, so that they could be more sensitive, like the teacher who you mentioned who offered that language to that student.
Exactly. And even simply by mentioning the words depression and anxiety or mentioning the issue itself, you're normalizing help-seeking behavior. So I always ask every single one of my middle school students at least once, maybe twice a year, to silently identify the person that they would go to in a crisis, the adult they'd go to in a crisis. And if they can't think of anyone at that moment, I always invite them to come talk to me later. And something that struck me over the years is I have never, ever done that exercise and not had someone come to talk to me right afterwards, either about themselves or about another student. I did this with, a couple of weeks ago, actually, and a student came to me really upset. And I thought that she was going to disclose that she herself was going through a rough time. And what it turned out was that she had been in online in a gaming chat room talking to a boy who had been making comments about being suicidal, and he did end up killing himself, and she hadn't told anyone because she felt so guilty that she hadn't gotten adult help for him. But opening that dialogue, opening that conversation allowed her to come and say, this is what happened. I'm really feeling this crushing guilt. Can you help me? So it had ended up causing quite a bit of distress for her anyway, and she needed that support.
Yeah, my heart goes out to that child and to all the children and adults who have had somebody in their life who has considered and or attempted and completed suicide. It's a horrific experience, and there are so many things that we can do to help inoculate children from that. And I'm very glad that you and I both have kids who are in Montgomery County schools that support, looking out for suicide awareness. I also want to just highlight one of the strategies you offered that is so huge for parents to say to the school, please let us know if you notice anything unusual. And just, that normal breaking of routine, having that conversation with a parent to be able to say, I noticed that he's consistently tired in the morning, or whatever it is, can really help. I mean, I know many of my students over the years might have said, probably would still say, that I was a little too involved in how they were doing, because I was always like, okay, well, I've noticed that you're tired every day when you get out of carpool. How are you doing? But I also felt like I'd rather err on the side of them knowing that I was kind of annoying and loved them so much than them wondering how I felt.
I'm sure they felt seen and cared for.
Yeah, yeah. I felt with my kids too.
Well, I think that's another developmental piece of it, especially with middle schoolers. To an adult, their concern can really seem overblown. It can seem like something that should pass and that they shouldn't really be losing sleep over or being so anxious about. And that's a mistake. You should really take everything seriously, not to be, so in their space that they can't breathe, but not because it is serious, but because they have these intense emotions and they have no perspective and no life experience. So for them, every circumstance is an emergency, and they need you to take it seriously in order to be able to support them and to say, I can see you're uncomfortable. I can help you feel better. I'll be by your side while we work and figure out how to do that.
Yeah, so important to let them know that you understand, or at least that you're there. I mean, I think adults often minimize what kids are going through and forget that for the kids, that's the biggest thing they've experienced. So
exactly.
that breakup in sixth grade of somebody who you never even went on a date with, but you were texting with, is the biggest heartbreak you've had. So it's huge. And so when adults are saying to kids, oh, this isn't a big deal, we're really saying, I think we're saying that we're not accessible.
Exactly. And, we're also in an era when community ties are not as strong. A parent isn't going to call another parent. They're going to want to mind their own business. They're not really necessarily going to call another parent and say, I think your child is giving away his belongings to my kid. And, I really encourage parents to stay to connect with each other and to kind of make a pact that they're going to share any concerns that they have about each other's kids, and send kids out to play in the neighborhood. I think part of the lack of control kids feel over their lives and part of the increase in anxiety and depression is because everything is so controlled. Their whole lives are managed for them, even down to their playtime. It's not really play. It's, trying out for a team or winning or losing a game. So these are anxiety provoking competitive situations. And, I would love to see schools bring back more self-directed play, more recess in some fashion.
Oh, you and me both. Let's start a movement. It's, you were also talking about, the kinds of things that when students make comments that don't seem like a big deal. But I'm also thinking about how, so often we minimize and overemphasize mental health issues. So what I mean by that is somebody saying, if they're very organizational, oh, it's the OCD in me, or they're having a hard time paying attention. It's my, I'm just being very ADD. And all these ways in which really important, very big words are being used as adjectives or adverbs.
That's a really good point.
And I'm thinking about how often students say that they hear microaggressions, the small unintentional injuries against their social identifier that go by and a teacher doesn't say anything. And teachers may say things about some of them. They may say something if they hear something about race, but then teachers often themselves use microaggressions about mental health issues. Like saying, I'm so depressed today. Well, today is, you're not depressed for a day if you're actually depressed.
Yeah. And some of that is the education piece, helping teachers understand what these different issues are and how they can impact a kid and what is the difference between stress and anxiety. And so that piece of it, a lot of that is just ignorance and not really understanding what those distinctions are. So what I tell teachers who don't really understand or who don't really know what to say or how to handle it is that you can never go wrong by validating. So if a child comes to you and says that they're upset about something that you think is ridiculous or that you think is their fault or that you think they brought on themselves or whatever it happens to be, you will never go wrong by validating the feeling and saying, you know what, I can see that you're frustrated. I would be frustrated too if I thought that the teacher never called on me or if the teacher was blaming me for something I didn't do. So how can we fix this? So you're not saying I'm validating that you didn't make a mistake or that I do never call on you or whatever it is. I think teachers can sometimes get stuck in that defensive posture, but you will never go wrong by validating whatever it is that's creating the distress in the first place. And they'll generally calm down and be more willing to have an open discussion about it at that point anyway.
That's such great advice for parents too.
True.
And I love that. I think one of the things that we in this work of working with kids who, I consider a complete privilege that kids spend part of their day talking to us. One of the things we can do is help equip parents for being on the receiving end of those conversations or the silence, depending on what's going on. And for teachers, and as much of those kinds of strategies we can offer is really helpful. What do you suggest that parents do when they're concerned about their child's mental health? And I'm, just imagining situations where a parent says, are you feeling okay? And the child says, yeah, fine. Yeah. And the internal gut that we have as parents is saying, yeah, not so much. But the kid's reaction is one that it doesn't elicit more questions or more conversation. What would you advise those parents to be thinking about or maybe to do?
You could do a few things. One is, one, it has to do with the way you're parenting the rest of the time, not just when they're hitting a rough patch. You want to be that kind of parent who is calm and non-reactive and who the child knows isn't going to freak out, because kids do not want to cause their parents pain. I hear this all the time in my banana splits or my divorce group. Kids will hold things in if they think it will upset their parent or disappoint their parent or change their parent's perception of them. And so as parents, we need to be really careful that we're communicating that we're fallible, that we make mistakes, that we expect them to make mistakes, that we don't expect them to feel good all the time. In fact, we don't feel good all the time, and that we're vocalizing those times when we're feeling miserable, and then also vocalizing how we're managing it or what we're doing to make ourselves feel better, but just making that part of our vocabulary. And also making it clear that if they do come to us, we're not going to be overly judgmental or reactive. So that's the rest of the time. But in the moment when, let's say all of that is in place and your child just isn't sharing what's going on, I would check in with the school. I would check in with the counselor. If they're on a team, I would talk to their coaches. I would start collecting information from all the other non-parental adults in their life. And I would also consult your pediatrician and just rule out anything, physical. And look at what's happening. What are the underlying possible root causes? Has there been a shift in their friend group? Are they struggling in a particular class? Are they going through puberty and, having issues with their changing body? Are they feeling like they're not performing as well on a sports team? Whatever those issues are, you will have an easier time addressing whatever the anxiety or depression is if you can figure out what the root cause is.
Makes sense. And it also makes sense because it gives parents something to do. You and I are parents, and how often do we have the experience as parents ourselves where if our kids are struggling with something, we just want to know what we can do. And gathering information, I'm thinking about, if I was a parent asking different people in my child's life saying, I may be overreacting, but I'd rather overreact and be wrong than not. That gives me, both as a parent, something to do, as well as puts the other person in partnership with us, because just by expressing that you're concerned about something, you're inviting that other adult in your child's life into partnership with you to also be looking out for what's going on.
Exactly. And, another piece of this that I think is important for parents to understand and for teachers to understand too is the difference between being proactive, reactive, and passive. If they're upset about something, there are things that they're going to have to let go, and there are things that they can change, and helping a child identify what it is that they can do to make their situation better can really alleviate their anxiety, again, by giving them that sense of agency and empowering them. So helping them understand that that they're not completely powerless, I think, is really important. And then also, making sure, particularly when it comes to, let's say it's a child who's come out and is getting bullied, you really want to make sure that whatever they do come and tell you, you're taking seriously and you're listening carefully, and that you are communicating as clearly as possible that whatever happens, you love them exactly as they are. You're there to be unconditionally loving. Your job is to love them and to support them and be by their side as they get whatever help they need, and you're going to help them get that help. Any judgment, any criticism can come from enough of that will come from the outside world. The parent's role is to just be that consistent, unwavering, supportive presence, a safe place to come home to.
reminding us again that parenting and teaching is about the child and not about us.
Exactly.
And I think parents would be well served to, in those kinds of situations, to find a peer group for themselves so that they can process their own emotions and not put their emotions into their child's process.
That's right. And, I spoke at a school about a week or two ago, and in passing, I mentioned the importance of self-care and being non-reactive before you engage in your child, taking a minute to calm yourself down and if you're on it, a parent had asked, what about if I can't calm myself down? What if it just really pushes my buttons, and no matter what happens, it's just we escalate it. And I said, well, that's when you really want to be looking at the bigger picture of your life. Are you getting the support you need? Are you getting enough exercise? Are you eating well? Are you sleeping? Because parents really need to put their oxygen mask on in order to be there for their kids. And the whole room just kind of went silent. And afterwards, they had some parent discussions, and I was wandering from room to room. And all of the discussions were really rooted in the idea that they themselves were not taking care of themselves. And stress is contagious. So if you're unable to center yourself and to get yourself in a good place, and you're not modeling caring for yourself, your child certainly is not going to be able to do it.
Absolutely. And why should they? If the modeling for them is that you're just going to always go do, and then do some more, why should kids look at it any differently than that's what's supposed to happen?
Exactly. And I think parents, everything is so performance oriented right now, and kids feel that. And, there's that existential anxiety, is my child getting what they need to be successful in the world? And we kind of overfreight things like tests and grades, and we forget to just stop and have a conversation. Just a general conversation. Mm-hmm. What position did you play during PE today? It doesn't really matter what it is, but just something that's not loaded in any way.
And also allowing for silence. I had a student tell me that he was on a road trip with his dad looking at colleges, and he loved the road trip. And the dad had been at a coffee and conversation that I was facilitating, and he was saying, gosh, I really just wanted more out of that. And so I went back to each of them and just said, what was that about? And for the kid, it was just being with his dad in silence and not having to do or to perform or anything like that was so nourishing for him. Whereas the dad was feeling like, oh, we're going to have this time, or we're going to have this bonding time. And his idea of bonding time and his child's idea of bonding time were different.
That's a really, really important point. And probably, depending on how long the trip was, eventually that dad would have gotten some good nuggets from his
Absolutely.
kid anyway.
I was saying that I imagine it was one exit past where they needed to be.
I have one of the affinity groups I run is for boys, and when you get them talking, that's one of the things I've heard over and over again. They just want that connection. They just want their parents' presence or their friends' presence. They don't have to be doing anything high level or having a conversation about something really personal or meaningful. It's the connection comes from just sharing that moment together, whatever they happen to be doing.
It's the simplest things, isn't it? We can make such a big difference in just being next to somebody.
Mm-hmm.
Oh, well, thank you so much, Phyllis. You've given us so much to think about. I hope you'll come back to Third Space because I have 30 questions that I want to ask you right now. And I'm sure
anytime, it's my pleasure. I always love talking to you, Jen.
Could you tell us, this is a part in Third Space where I always ask guests to let us know something that they think people should be thinking about and where to follow you. And I'm also just going to add the title of your book so that they could have some of these nuggets for them to read for themselves and digest and get these ideas on time that works for them.
Sure. So I have a book that's actually available now on Amazon. It's called Middle School Matters. It will be out in August. And I tweet at Fagell pretty regularly, and I blog at phyllisfagell.com. And in terms of thinking about questions or thoughts to leave with, I think the main thing for me is that different doesn't mean broken. And when I say that, I don't just mean that about kids, I mean that about parents too, because parents are so hard on themselves. And I really encourage parents to celebrate what makes them unique, because if they do that and they take pride in their own differences, their child is going to as well. I think we need to spend less time worrying about what's normal and being conformist and more time helping kids really branch out and own who they are in an authentic way.
Powerful words to leave on. And I appreciate you taking the time. I want to just invite anybody who is on Twitter to follow you for the education, but also for the humor. You share the funniest quotes from students. And I have had many moments when I thought, I just need something funny. I wonder if Phyllis has tweeted. So thank you.
Oh, you're welcome. I think I do that for the same reason. In that kind of work, we need the humor.
Absolutely. Well, you've been listening to Third Space. This is Jen Court. I'm your host. To find out more about my work, you can log on to www.jencourt.com or follow me on all social media. Phyllis can be found on Twitter and her blog. We'll put the links into the episode notes. You've been listening to this on voiceed.ca, where your voice is heard. Please like, review, and subscribe to Third Space. It really does help us to get noticed.